Okay, so before we get into our full discussion, there's a couple things I want to draw into the conversation. First and foremost, today is the Feast of All Saints. And I love this day because it is a time where we give sacred space to one of the hardest things about life. And that is that death and mortality are a reality of our existence. It's part of our lives in God and with one another and with the earth. And it is not pleasant. Many of you here have recently lost dearly loved ones. And I can only imagine the pain you must be feeling. But something I want to say that I also said the other day when I was at the Masonic Homes is something that comes to mind every time we celebrate Ash Wednesday. Well, celebrate's the wrong word. We observe Ash Wednesday. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Now, raise your hand if when you heard that growing up all your life that thought, you're nothing but dust. You are worthless. You are less than nothing. You mean nothing. The only thing good in you is what God puts in you. That was certainly the theology that I grew up with the influence of John Calvin. And I'm wondering if that might have been the medieval theology in the Catholic Church that we've carried over that comes into play. But science tells us that we are made of the dust of stars. We are made of cosmic material. Therefore, one might say, remember that you are stardust, and to stardust you return. Who created stars? God. We are made of God, and to God we return. However one understands what happens when we pass through that veil that's very thin this time of year between this life and whatever comes beyond, that is the fundamental reality of our existence. We come from God, God's self, who is the ground of all being, and we return to God. Therefore, we will be reunited with those whom we love but see no more. It may not be the way we think it will be. It may be the way we think it will be. I certainly don't know. I've given up trying to have those answers. The questions are a lot more interesting to me. But to remember the importance of the fact that even those whom we desperately wish we could have back for just one more minute, they are in God. They are in God's arms, just as we are in God's arms in different manifestations of what it means to come from the source of all that is. And that is the great gift of the Feast of All Saints, is that remembrance, that mourning, that loss, that death are integral to the fullness of our lives with God. Not a failure, not something that's taken away from us, but part of that fullness of God's life. And that death is never the end. It is merely a change. And we'll do in a little while during the prayers of the people, where if you have memorabilia of loved ones whom you love but see no more, you will be invited to place items that remind you of them on the altar. And those of you on Zoom will have you hold those up and have you call out the name of that person that you love and see no more. And that's a way of naming the cloud of saints that are with us in this room, even though they're not in their physical bodies the way we once knew them. That's the first thing. Just as that cloud of witnesses goes on before us, and just as we will go on before those who will come after us, we are part of not only God's family, God's being, we are also part of God's kingdom and have that responsibility to build God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. And that is by following the way of God. The last couple of years, like I've said, and for those of you who haven't been here, whoever you may be, we focused on discipleship a few years ago. What is your lived experience of God? How does that manifest in your relationships with others? How does St. Anne's make that happen? How does St. Anne's play into that? And what would happen to your discipleship if this church were to go away? Remembering the importance of figuring out how do we follow the way of God. And what is the way of God and Jesus? Love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. If all the law and the prophets are contained in those two commandments, we do well as a church to stop worrying about anything else until we focus primarily on following that way. Last year, we looked at calling. We took the Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman's definition of calling is don't figure out what the world needs. Find out what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs are people who are fully alive. It's that thing that makes your heart sing, that you cannot escape, that brings you fullness of life. It was a question that was asked of the bishop candidates last night, and it was really neat to see their answers to those questions. What is your calling? What makes you come alive? What makes you be able to sustain yourself through frustration, through burnout, through bitterness, through world catastrophes constantly happening around us, that keeps you alive, full of light, full of fire, full of love? Then we looked at what makes St. Anne's come alive. What is our calling as a congregation? Because it's not just about our individual calling. And calling, by the way, just to remind you, is not just for clergy. Everyone is called. And the church has done a great disservice to all of us by saying that clergy are the only ones who have authority in the church to bring about God's kingdom. Every single one of you has a calling, a gift. And just as we as individuals have that calling and a gift, we bring those together and we discern what the calling that God has for us as a congregation. Then out into the deanery, the diocese, the broader church beyond the Episcopal Church, of which there are many manifestations. And then, what would Fremont or the surrounding areas do? What would happen to their spirituality if we were gone and could not give that calling? To remind us of how we are indispensable to the world around us. And this year, we're looking at how do we cultivate practice with these things. They're great ideals, lovely abstracts. You know me, I'm a philosopher, so I love to think in those big abstracts. But it doesn't mean anything if we don't do things. We don't make this part of how we cultivate our concepts of life. I talked a minute ago about the fact that the church has done a great disservice to us by having the clergy do things for everyone. If you were in the Episcopal Church pre-Vatican II, pre-1979 prayer book, how was my stance would be if I were celebrating the Eucharist? Like this. Holding your prayers on your behalf, where you just sat there and watched me do it. What does that tell you about your part? What does that tell you about what church is? Fundamentally opposite to what I'm trying to drive home, and we're trying really hard in a really challenging time in the world to reimagine church. To reimagine where Sunday morning is one aspect of who we are. It is not the aspect of who we are. Church is when we have the open mic. That's just as sacramental to me as what we do here. Church is when we meet the needs of the community, when we reach out to one another, when we help one another. And so the cultivating practices is how do we make sure that we support this community so that it never does go away, so that it can fulfill its mission? How do we take care of the buildings and grounds? You see the grounds, they're gorgeous, but they're a lot to keep up with, and we have very limited resources. The more we all step in, the better off we are. How do we take care of one another? How do we make sure that no one drops off, no one gets forgotten, and certainly that your priest knows what's going on? It's a fascinating thing sometimes, and I'm like, wait, someone was in the hospital? Oh crap, not really an issue here, but it has been in the past, and that's a terrifying place to be. And then, how do we make sure we figure out what we can do? What are practicable steps, realistic steps, to make sure that we fulfill our calling to the world outside these walls? As a gentleman said recently at an event I went to, we are used to hosting as church, but we are not used to being hosted. To think about getting out of our doors, out of our buildings, into the community, doing all kinds of things that share that love of God, love of, and love of self. and draw people into that community that transcends religion but is found within it.